Thank you so much for having me. And thank you everyone at the Center for Gender and Sexual Health Equity. It's a real great honor to be here and to be part of the Center's speaking series for this year amongst so many brilliant other scholars. Thank you to Professor Shira Goldenberg for the invitation, and to Carly for coordinating, and the rest of the team, Hannah and Kate. And also, I'm so lucky to have my colleague and collaborator provide that generous introduction, Professor Andrea Cruci. Thank you for being here. I'm coming to you as a settler on unceded territory of the Algonquin in Ottawa. Today, I'm going to talk through some of my work that I've been doing for the past few years on the intersections of HIV criminalization, big data analytics, and public health surveillance, with the goal of sketching out a conception of a notion of carceral public health. Public health has been changing in the age of big data, where digitized information such as the biomaterial of people, like the unique genetic sequences of HIV in my body, can be shared widely, aggregated with others, and then used to predict and preempt theoretical risks. This poses ethical questions for consent, the notion of the public, where such practices are taking place in a context of ongoing criminalization of HIV, sex work, drug use, poverty, migration, and along with homophobic and racist fears embedded into public health practice. Further, there has become an increased reliance on public health in concert with police enforcement responses in the context of COVID-19. As well, where police have been positioned as central actors in responding to public health. A recent report from the University of Sherbrooke from Véronique Fortin and colleagues outlined that in 1 year, more than 46,000 tickets were issued across Quebec for violations against public health laws. In the context of HIV, there have been some very helpful legal reforms over the past few years, which I'll touch on later. But as the scope of criminal law responses to HIV is narrowed, new forms of public health policy and practice may emerge, where public health officials, police, and criminal justice system may act in concert in ways to govern HIV prevention. The ongoing blurring of boundaries between the institutional domains of public health and criminal justice has the potential to produce new harms in the lives of people living with HIV. And having a robust understanding and terminology and frames of reference will help both academics and movements of people living with HIV as we work to seek emancipation from social structures that inhibit our ability to be fully realized people with complex subjectivities, autonomy over our lives, and to live with dignity. All of the work I reference here is collaborative, so up front I must state how grateful I am for my many co-conspirators and comrades, who you all know who you are, and much of this work is ongoing, so this is still a sketch of things in progress intended to be generative, not definitive. Carceral is a term that has grown in prominence to highlight a criminal justice system logic of reliance on forms of incarceration and surveillance to organize society and social problems. And indeed, public health has always been rooted in a carceral approach and has relied on a continuum of practices from voluntary to coercive. Since its inception in the Dominion of Canada, public health was founded on white supremacist ideals of racial and moral purity, rooted in eugenics and aimed at containing impurities. Women with sexually transmitted infections known to be sex workers, labeled as vagrants, often indigenous or non-white settlers, were regularly incarcerated in the early 1900s as a means of disease control. And for public health, the management of risk was constituted as a new kind of clinical judgment that diverged from earlier forms of medical reasoning, which used to attempt to distinguish the normal from the pathological. Public health was different and was focused only on risk management and prevention. As Lorna Weir has noted, bodies at risk are neither sick nor healthy. Weir was examining, or had examined, healthcare for pregnant women, underlining how the life of the baby was supported at the expense of the rights of the mother. When a subject failed to comply with incitements for security of health, then disciplinary confinement and correction could be activated. For such authoritarian forms of discipline to be invoked, security must be appealed via a life and death significance. And Weir noted that such an instance could include infectious disease outbreaks or epidemics, where liberal freedoms may be suspended. Once voluntary measures stopped working for governance, more coercive forms of control could emerge. And in Discipline and Punish, Michel Foucault outlines the idea of the carceral archipelago, I can never pronounce that word, referring both to the collection of islands, to a collection of islands, and that which is related to jails and prisons, as a metaphor for a continuum of practices and mechanisms and technologies and knowledge systems and networks that related to the carceral. And his widely used and perhaps overused book has helped elaborate the dispersion of a carceral logic throughout social institutions, such as schools, hospitals, and throughout society. Others have taken this understanding further in the contemporary moment, such as prison abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who has elaborated a conception of carceral geography, which examines the complex interrelationships amongst landscape, natural resources, political economy, infrastructure, policing, and the infrastructure of policing, jailing, caging, and controlling of populations. My colleague Nicolas Carrier and Justin Pichet outlined that for prison and penal abolitionists, the move to address carceral abolitionism is one that acknowledges those detained beyond solely criminal justice grounds, where they say the move from penal to carceral abolitionism is done by examining preventative detention used under the guise of the war on terror, the skyrocketing confinement of immigrants and refugees, as well as the rise of mass surveillance that is increasingly transforming the world into an open-air prison. Carceral feminism has been brought forth from responses to domestic violence with the transformative justice movement, as outlined by Victoria Law in the article Against Carceral Feminism, Relying on the State to Curb Domestic Violence, only ends up harming the most marginalized women. She describes an approach that sees increased policing, prosecution, and imprisonment as the primary solution to violence against women. And Law notes that carceral feminists would likely reject the term and not view themselves this way. Critiques of carceral feminism, such as from Anna Terwell, have suggested that the term results in an oversimplification, presenting a binary choice between the criminal legal system and informal community justice practices. First, she states, this binary allows critics to overlook rather than engage feminist disagreements about state and sexual harm. And second, they narrow the focus on alternative solutions to harm, obscuring the plural and contested nature of prison abolition. And I fear the same could take place with the conception of carceral public health. And so my goal is not to create an oversimplification. There's no slides. I don't have slides. I'm not a PowerPoint person. Sorry. You get to stare at my face while I read. But I can share my talk afterwards if you like, and it will be recorded. But I fear that the same could take place with the conception of carceral public health. And so my goal is not to create an oversimplified binary of options to manage health issues, but to give us a language to articulate the problems that result from carceral logics in a health context. So in this effort, I'd like to promote a nuanced approach proposed by critical public health scholar Eric Mikolavsky and his colleagues as a critical social science with public health perspective. Such an approach seeks opportunities for research that engages with public health, to transform public health practice, to lessen the harmful effects, while contributing to critical social science. And I'm a critical social scientist, and more specifically, a critical criminologist, so this is where I'd like things to go. But such a generous approach to working with public health, with a public health perspective, is hard for me. This approach is something I am wrestling with, which I'll elaborate on. I come to academia as an activist and as someone living with HIV, and as someone who has been working to address the rights and dignity and humanity of those of us living with the virus. In Canada, there's over 65,000 people living with HIV and over 35 million of us around the world. And I've had HIV my entire life. I found out my status in the late 90s when I was 18. It was about a year after the introduction of antiretroviral medications that began to curb the massive death rate. But still, at the time, my doctor told me I wouldn't live past 30 years old. And public health nurses told me to refrain from sex altogether, or they counseled me about my obligations to disclose to sex partners for fear of criminal prosecution. Also, at the time, there was a news story all over the media about a man being criminally charged for allegedly not telling a sex partner that he was HIV positive. The only popular representations of positive people I had ever seen were either that we were dying or we were criminals. In public health campaigns, it was implied that we were to be feared and that no one would want to end up like us. For some, life with HIV has been radically transformed into a state of near normalcy. In Canada, due to our healthcare system, the only HIV-related bodily harm I'm likely to face is from the police, from the criminal justice system, from public health institutions, or from people's hatred. It often seems to me the fear that has made HIV criminalization is the same fear underpinning HIV prevention efforts. To those of us living with HIV, fear is the real problem, not HIV. This fear and lack of connection to the lived reality of people living with HIV is something deeply rooted in some public health practices, fear and paternalism. And despite some recent progress, Canada is still a hotspot for HIV criminalization, where the act of allegedly not disclosing one's HIV positive status to sex partners under certain circumstances can lead to a serious criminal offense, including aggravated sexual assault, one of the harshest offenses in the criminal code. And such offenses can lead to long periods of incarceration, sensationalistic media coverage, registration as a sex offender, or daily forms of stigma and discrimination. And to date in Canada, there have been at least 206 individuals prosecuted in 224 different criminal cases between 1989 and 2020. And thanks to the work of Colin Hastings and others, we know that this is a highly racialized and gendered issue, with Black men and Indigenous women overrepresented in these cases. The ways the laws have been applied have been further shown to disproportionately impact women living with HIV, putting them at heightened risk for gender-based violence due to power differentials in relationships. These cases often intersect with other criminalized phenomenon and groups of people, such as people who sell sex, as some women prosecuted in relation to HIV non-disclosure were also sex workers. And for my dissertation research, I went across Canada and spent time with and spoke with people who are on the sex offender registry, who had been incarcerated and who are in the process of criminal trials or who have been threatened in relation to HIV non-disclosure. Speaking directly with people who have been criminally charged puts into question the dominant understanding that people living with HIV are violent perpetrators who are actively trying to transmit to others. Rather, what comes to be institutionally understood by wrongdoing as wrongdoing by police or by courts or by public health or the media is much less obviously so. Because of criminalization, complex and nuanced situations, including people's silence, fear, actual disclosure, or in some cases, the inability to address their own HIV status is forced by the criminal justice system into a dichotomous narrative of victim and perpetrator. As a critical criminologist, I know that no group of people is inherently criminal. Rather, criminalization is just shifting process that targets certain people at certain times for certain purposes. The shifting nature of criminalization of HIV aligns with the constructivist understanding of the law as elaborated by Nicholas Rose and Mariana Valverde as not a unified phenomenon governed by certain principles, but rather a social and political economic discursive construction that can be applied to regulate aspects of society at specific moments in time. Criminalization is not the natural outcome of so-called wrongdoing. What this means is that the criminalization of HIV has been actively negotiated and put in place historically by a wide range of social forces, actors, and institutions. And as such, it can be open to contestation and change. The Dichotomous victim versus perpetrator logic of the criminal justice system, the process of criminalization transforms people into objects of risk and threat. And in many cases, public health institutions can reinforce the conception of risk through their actions, policies, and work. I spoke with 16 people in 27 interviews over 2 years, and none of them intended to cause harm to anyone else. Because of how they were treated by the criminal justice system, public health authorities, and the media, through spending time in administrative segregation, which is essentially solitary confinement, losing access to privacy with their health information spread all over the media, being assaulted and harassed by corrections officials and police, being forced into counseling which pathologized their normal sexual behaviors, as well as being denied medical care and HIV treatments while incarcerated, to name a few. All of these people I spoke with as a result of these experiences and more had a hard time psychologically coping with being understood as a violent rapist, as the sex they had was consensual. It was the twisted logic of the criminal justice system, which classifies it as a non-consensual sex act via aggravated sexual assault. None of them met the criteria of being a sex offender, but were still mandated to continue in sex offender programs, including undergoing phallometric testing while being forced to watch violent sexual assaults. And today, due to various forms of violence they experience because of being criminalized, many of the people I spoke with indicated that they live with post-traumatic stress disorder, which has a wide range of impacts on their daily lives. And as a result of their experiences of criminalization, all 16 people had tried to commit suicide or had long periods of suicidal ideation. And speaking of binary options, public health has often been positioned as the rational and benevolent way out of criminalization, with the use of public health legislation being posited as a less severe instrument of the state than criminal laws. An example of this is from 1990 with Dr. Richard Schabas, who was Ontario's Chief Medical Officer of Health from 1987 to 1997, and who called for HIV to be classified as a virulent disease, meaning under a court order from the medical officer of health, someone could be coercively detained in a hospital. This came about after a widely sensationalized case of a man who had migrated from Africa who was facing multiple charges of HIV non-disclosure, and a widespread racist media panic resulted. Schabas said there was a danger of HIV becoming criminalized and proposed the alternate public health option, but that option was to quarantine us. Like criminalization, Schabas's public health option also focused on a form of coercion and detention and incapacitation, but quarantine does not have the same evidentiary requirements of the criminal justice system or oversight of a jury, and it was just the will of the medical officer of health to decide. His proposal was to put in force the law of quarantine of people living with HIV, and that led to the largest AIDS Action Now protest to date in Canada, with over 500 people at Queen's Park demanding his resignation. Despite that, he stayed in his position for many years, although withdrawing his proposal to label HIV a virulent disease. Furthermore, when you investigate cases of HIV non-disclosure, the simple binary between criminal law and public health law is undone, as they are not neatly parsed out. Instead, there is a productive cross-fertilization of the two institutions, and productive in a sense of leading to increased harm for people living with HIV. In fact, they can be co-constitutive of each other, they can reinforce each other, and they can be deeply connected. Two people that I interviewed had been charged only a few months after testing HIV positive, with public health officials aiding the police in their cases, one who was under 18 years old and the other who was in his early 20s. Imagine, instead of seeing one's role in public health as providing young people with the tools to navigate their sexualities and HIV disclosure in a society that deeply fears our bodies, to instead see your role as to call the police. In many cases, on top of criminal laws, public health law has been mobilized to increase surveillance and enhance treatment adherence, curfews, or mandate condom use or forms of counseling. For some gay men I interviewed, the public health counseling, however, promoted incorrect practices, such as using condoms for oral sex, a practice unnecessary when an individual is virally undetectable. These men had already learned about HIV and sexual health from local AIDS organizations, information they used with their partners. The mandated sexual health counseling was out of sync with what they had learned from AIDS organizations, and it made them feel pathologized and bad. They felt the mandated public health counseling approach was driven by homophobic fears of gay sex. And because the counseling was mandated, they no longer trusted many healthcare workers and felt scared to talk to them truthfully about their sex lives. They now equated public health workers with just another part of the criminal justice system. A criminal charge with a public health order in a person's past can increase the intensity of the criminal law's application, understanding a person as an increased risk to the public. For example, in 2011, when Ontario prosecuted the first known person in the world with a first-degree murder charge due to HIV non-disclosure and exposure, the man, an immigrant from an African country, had a past of non-compliance with public health orders. And along with testimony from public health officials, that past was used by a forensic psychiatrist to deem him a dangerous offender, an official designation in Canadian law, meaning he could be detained indefinitely after he has served his sentence as a preemptive measure to protect the public because he was perceived as such an intense risk. The man claimed that public health officials were racist and culturally insensitive towards him, and he had been not provided the tools to navigate life as an HIV positive person. There are also countless instances of people living with HIV being coerced and surveilled by public health or being threatened with criminalization. One man I spoke with for my research took his girlfriend for public health counseling after he found out his status. She was HIV negative and she remained so. And public health nurses told her she could press charges. So after a fight with him, a few months later, she did. He was undetectable, and instead of supporting the couple to realize their collective health, public health became just an arm of the police. In another instance, a friend was advised by her doctors to breastfeed her newborn baby because she was undetectable and virally uninfectious. But because she was HIV positive, public health authorities opened an investigation against her, despite her doctor's expert advice. And instead of a time of beauty and celebration that she, an HIV positive woman, was able to have a baby, that time was marked by fear, surveillance, and suspicion that she could lose custody because of the public health investigation. Another friend moved cities across the country, and within a few months in his new home and city, he received a letter from public health authorities which they asked him to call them. When he did, they stated that they knew his HIV status and warned him about his legal duty to disclose to all sex partners. Instead of working to connect him to care, he was left feeling threatened, surveilled, and as though he was on the threshold of criminalization due to his interaction with public health. That interaction was post the 2012 Supreme Court decision, so the public health authorities were not even communicating the law correctly, as we only need to disclose when not using a condom and having a suppressed viral load at the same time. They said he needed to disclose to all sexual partners. So fear and ignorance prevail. In some provinces, that rule has now changed as prosecutorial guidelines have been introduced in Ontario and Quebec. Where there will be no charge if someone has a suppressed viral load, which is a good thing, but at the same time, as a result, people who have achieved viral suppression come to be responsibilized subjects complying with medical and treatment regimes, while those who are virally unsuppressed may be understood as risky, dangerous, or on the threshold of criminality. Those, of course, will often be people with less access who are made to be marginalized. Take, for example, the case of a trans woman in Edmonton who police issued a public safety warning about misgendering her, claiming she was high risk because she was a sex worker and that she had a high viral load. The release made it to the media with a mugshot identifying her as the vilest of threats. Also, consider in the province of British Columbia in June 2019, in what was noted as an unprecedented intervention when public health authorities collaborated with the Vancouver police to conduct a widely publicized manhunt. They released the photograph, name, and description of a man who allegedly violated conditions under the Provincial Public Health Act for not adhering to his HIV medication regime. He was feared to be virally unsuppressed and therefore uninfectious. Here we have two instances of public health relying on the police to manage our viral loads. While in BC, the issuing of a public health order was considered unprecedented, in Ontario, this is a common occurrence, although engaging with the police and media to enforce an order is rare. And in BC, there are the guidelines, the BC guidelines for medical officers of health approach to people with HIV/AIDS who may pose a risk to harm to others. This policy discourages the calling of police, but also states in the unlikely event of that the medical officer of health does consider that a referral to the police may be necessary in order to protect the public, it is strongly recommended that legal counsel be preceded before doing so. So while there is some measured language, there is a codified role for the police in the public health policy. And then there is also the issue of out-of-care watch lists, and I'd encourage you to investigate the research of Stephen Maldrum, who has examined this issue in the US context. There is a watch list program in BC called RETAIN through the Center for Excellence, which seeks to flag people who are considered out of care for intensified engagement with public health authorities. And keep in mind that some people want to stay off of the public health record, and that being engaged by public health can be a risk. For migrants, for example, who may be here so-called unofficially, it could actually be rational to not engage with public health investigations for fear of risk of deportation. All of these interactions, policies, and practices outline to me what Gary Kinsman has long stated. When talking about public health, we must always ask who is the public and whose health. As HIV positive people, we are rarely engaged as members of the public by public health authorities or otherwise. Instead, we are understood to be risks that need to be contained to protect the actual public. And so you can see why I have a hard time viewing public health in a generous light, and why a critical social science with public health perspective is a challenge. If public health sees us as a group to continually conceptualize as objects of risk and to antagonize, how could I not? And so this context brings me to the issue of molecular HIV surveillance, a practice that was innovated in BC and is being exported around the world. In this context, where Canada has been a global leader for criminalizing HIV non-disclosure, the country has also been a global leader in innovations in prevention. Epidemiologists, public health experts, and infectious disease specialists have been increasingly mobilizing molecular surveillance techniques to identify, manage, and control disease outbreaks. And this is happening from influenza, tuberculosis, syphilis, HIV, and COVID-19. And the practices of molecular surveillance vary by disease. But in general, the aim is to rapidly and accurately identify molecularly similar strains of a virus that can be connected into clusters. And this idea of this approach is to identify these clusters in near real time, where transmissions are likely taking place, and then intervened with enhanced public health approaches to connect people to treatment, care, testing, and diagnostics. And that was stated from Poon from the BC Center of Excellence in the Lancet. And to conduct molecular HIV surveillance, public health authorities mobilize the results of people's HIV resistance tests, which are taken in a clinical setting. Local public health departments want to identify these clusters where HIV is being transmitted at higher and faster rates than other places, with the idea to intervene and prevent transmission. The BC Center for Excellence in HIV has been deploying genotyping testing in the province using an automated system for identifying clusters. As of 2016, the database held 32,000 anonymized, and I'll talk about that in a second, HIV genotypes for close to 9,000 British Columbia residents living with HIV. Approximately 5 to 6 genotypes are added to the system each day, which is automatically triggered to conduct an automated reanalysis of the entire data pool. The system generates reports on the growth characteristics of clusters, which are then reported to public health officials. In 2014, the system reported a growing cluster of 11 new HIV cases within 3 months among a group of young gay men, including 8 cases with transmitted drug resistance. As a result, public health officials intervened with enhanced public health follow-up to ensure linkage to care and treatment initiation in the affected subpopulation. 9 of the men were already connected to care, so it is uncertain what the real impact of the intervention had beyond invasions of privacy and consent. And this molecular HIV surveillance approach means scientists and authorities take the individual genetic makeup of people living with HIV and compare them in a laboratory. This analysis is done outside of a healthcare setting and without the knowledge of the people whose blood is being examined. The people whose clinical tests are examined for this new purpose are not asked for the consent and most likely unaware that their blood is being used in this way. And if they were informed, many people would disagree or refuse. In one study in the US, when people living with HIV were asked if they would consent to participate having their blood used for molecular analysis, 50% did not consent, indicating fears and concerns related to loss of privacy, confidentiality, as well as disinterest, lack of time, or unwillingness to share their HIV status with others. When me and a group of concerned HIV positive activists and scholars responded to one harmful article in The Lancet in 2019, a study done using this approach, which framed trans women as vectors of transmission in Los Angeles. The researchers responded back to us that the public good of HIV surveillance justifies the practice of violating consent. Therefore, it is in the public interest to violate the rights of people living with HIV. Once again, we are not the public. The major finding of the study was that trans women were having sex with straight men determined in a laboratory by epidemiologists. And if you've ever met a straight or bi trans woman, this finding is not a shocker because women are having sex with men. And it puts into question what public benefit such research even has when it is so disconnected from the actual lives as people is purported to support. And last month, there was another harmful article published in The Lancet in a similar vein. This also resulted in people responding saying that the findings of molecular surveillance were something that they already know because it's a fancy new toy. Then there's a new way where people living with HIV can be objectified as a fetish, a risk object to examine from afar. It's still being widely deployed. Beyond violations of consent, there is also an issue of data sharing. And I know I have only a little bit more time, so I'll touch on this quickly. The data from molecular HIV surveillance only comes to life when it's connected with other demographic details. Once your biomaterial is digitized, it can be widely shared or connected to other data sets. One study conducted in Montreal, Canada, called a large cluster outbreak sustain the HIV epidemic amongst gay men and other men who have sex with men in Quebec, outlines how multiple data sources were used to conduct the research, including sequencing data from government public health surveillance, along with clinical and behavioral data from a local research cohort on HIV rapid testing. The study identified Haitian migrant men who have sex with men as a driving force in the province's epidemic. Country of origin of transmission is something often sought in these studies, which was done in this one, that HIV is being brought in from a racialized outsider. And in a highly xenophobic province and country, rife with anti-Black racism, not once did the study acknowledge this context or even the issue of HIV criminalization. There are also multiple databases around the world which collect genetic sequences for other research. Researchers publicly share their data sets of sequences which can be viewed online. Data from one of these labs was used by the Crown as evidence for proving country of origin in a major HIV criminalization case to highlight that the person brought HIV from Africa and infected white women here. And across Canada, due to the creeping privatization of healthcare, our blood is held by private companies such as Life Labs and Dynacare, who lack mechanisms for transparency and accountability. I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit because I wrote too much. But data is not benign. This is true of data and biomaterial collected from molecular HIV surveillance and through other public health forms of surveillance. When placed in a social context of ongoing institutional violence and racism, data can be weaponized to pathologize, to target, to regulate and control, which includes denial of our rights to consent, autonomy, and autonomy over the uses of our own blood. In a context of criminalization and ongoing pathologizing from public health, this is a concern for our safety and security. And yes, I know that public health is not a monolith, and I know that people working in public health see their work as benevolent and in the service of good, but that doesn't mean that it always is. Along with being a critical social scientist, I am also an anarchist with an ethos of working in, against, and beyond systems of oppression to help address the harms in the here and now, along with a long-term vision of abolition of social structures that produce harm. And I hope that I have sketched what I've sketched out here today a little bit is something that can be heard by public health actors as an appeal for change. So what is carceral public health? In terms of carcerality, with our biomaterial linked to who we are, where we live, and what behaviors we engage in a context of ongoing criminalization of public health and public health pathologizing, the notion of transforming the world into an open-air prison becomes more and more real. With big data analytics, carcerality has new means and can expand its reach and modes of operating. Such a public health, like the criminal justice system, is organized to manage risks to a conceptual public. It is rooted in racism and colonization. It is focused on the prevention and preemption of risk, the prevention of the many through the coercion and control of the few. This is a containment and incapacitation, a use of criminal law means to achieve some perceived health ends. In the context of ongoing criminalization of policing, public health legislation should not and cannot be understood as easily divorced from other components of this apparatus, or as a form of jurisprudence that can only be applied in the silo. These approaches are connected, and to undo them, we need to understand this complexity. Finally, as such a public health sees the people living with HIV, such a public health sees the health of people living with HIV as an instrument. For people living with HIV, such a system results in our lives being over-policed, but we are underprotected. We live under heightened state surveillance, but we are provided limited protections when we actually need help. We are deemed unworthy of care and support unless that is instrumental to helping us prevent HIV transmission to others. So to move beyond this system with an eye to abolition, it is time to give a name to these practices and to call for a response which are in the interest of our dignity and flourishing, which are driven by our communities and which are rooted in what Stephen Maldrum and Anthony K.J. Smith called HIV data justice, responses to collective issues which are attuned to our rights as members of the public. Thank you.